Record this computer. Okay, so we're recording. All right, so, and then I have to share. Come on. Oh, wait a minute. And then I have to do this, right? Yes. And then I need to do that. Hi, Justin.
Hi.
Hi. Okay. All right. So here we go. What I want to look at for my little bit today is the Allied side of the invasion. And Torsten, of course, will talk about the German end of things on D-Day and immediately after, up to July 24th, which was the eve of Operation Cobra, which is the breakout, Patton's Third Army breakout through Normandy, the Falaise pocket, and then down to Paris, liberation of Paris on the 25th of August, 1944. And so we'll do that next time, Cobra to the liberation of Paris, and that will take us all the way through where we're going from, Operation Neptune through D-Day out to Paris. Okay, so the Allied invasion of Normandy. And I use that picture in the title slide for a specific reason. That's not my dad's plane that I know of, but that's from his group, the 387th Bombardment Squadron. And he flew B-26s, he's a bombardier, and he flew on D-Day. He flew 4 missions on D-Day over Utah Beach. So I don't know if that's his plane, but that's a plane from his group. So I think that's kind of a cool thing, and it's a way to connect me personally to what we're going to go and see. Okay, we'll talk more about that in a minute. All right, so the biggest problem, of course, for the Allies in the early part of 1944 was where to invade. And some Allied commanders thought the best place to invade was on the Britain Peninsula, because it was contained, of course, on 3 sides by water. They could also easily get to the port city of Nantes, which was a major German submarine base from which a number of submarines that had created wolf packs were launched. So they thought that they could control the sea around the peninsula, the 3 sides, make the Germans fight much more hard, much more difficult fight to hold Brittany, and there were a bunch of really good deep water ports, so they could bring in lots of supplies. But it was just too far away from Britain proper. The Cotentin Peninsula, which has Cherbourg at the northern tip of it, was a major deep water port, and it was the closest to a landing ground that the Allies could find. It too, water on 3 sides, and since the Allies controlled the sea, they would figure that would be a good deal. But of course, that too had too many limitations, because there was only 1 port, and they wanted to land on a broader front than was available at Cotentin. So they decided on Normandy, with the other option being the Pas de Calais, and they built, of course, Patton's ghost First Army around the Pas de Calais to confuse the Germans, thinking they were actually going to invade there. And so a lot of German troops were, stuck there, and they remained stuck there for quite a while, allowing Operation Overlord to succeed. Normandy's biggest drawback was, from the Allied perspective, there weren't enough ports. And as we talked about before, that meant, well, you can see on the map here how difficult it is, because there's really no ports of any great size or value here. Le Havre is across the estuary, the Seine estuary, and then, of course, Cherbourg is way over here on the Cotentin Peninsula, where Brittany, which was just too far away, had Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Melun, and Nantes as well. So, this is kind of a no man's land in a way, because there aren't a whole lot of ports there. But nevertheless, that was where they figured it would be the easiest place to get a lot of boots on the ground and to invade. So again, of course, we built the Mulberry Harbor, as we talked about last time, and this is an aerial view from Arromanches, And if we're lucky, we'll get to drive by this and see it. This is from the British beaches, but still these things were built. Okay, so Overlord. The Allies wanted to invade on the 1st of May. That was their target date to put the operation into action. The problem for the Americans especially, but the British as well, was that they didn't have enough landing craft infantry by 1 May. A bunch of them had been deployed in the Pacific for the early parts of the island hopping campaigns. They had to literally be moved across the rest of the world to get them to Britain so they could be used in the Atlantic operations. A number of landing craft had also been used in the Mediterranean, and they had to be shifted and moved around. And new stuff had to be either built or shipped in from the United States. So Eisenhower and the Americans and the British, Montgomery, had to wait until June to be able to launch the invasion. And they wanted to go on June 1, but the wretched weather in the Channel delayed the assault until the 6th. And those folks, in the group who read about this and have read about it, of course, picking June 6th was a very difficult day because the weather was so bad and the tides wouldn't be right for like another 3 weeks. So Eisenhower faced a really difficult decision on these evenings in early June to decide to actually push the button and go ahead and loose the invasion. Because everybody was afraid that if this failed, it would have just been a complete disaster. It's also true, and it's important to remember, especially when we're there, when we're driving around, I'll talk about this, and we can, Torstein to both talk about this. I'm sure our tour guide will talk about it as well. When we're on the ground in Normandy, looking at the terrain as we drive through it, the plans from the Allied perspective were uber complex. They were extremely complex, and they were all interlinked and interrelated, and they all had to work really well together to achieve the desired results. And of course, this was the largest single seaborne invasion ever attempted in history. Never been done before. I mean, yeah, they'd had, good dress rehearsals in Sicily, North Africa, Operation Torch, and the island hopping campaign, which wasn't even done yet. But this was huge, and the planning was really intense and interlinked, and it had to work seamlessly between land, naval, air forces, and the French resistance. And as we'll see, oftentimes the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And of course, in war, that means people die, and it's really unfortunate. But that's part of the problems that we see with this invasion, is it's just so complex, and it just doesn't always mesh as it's supposed to. And here's a quick look at the naval bombardment boxes and the naval bombardment lanes that were all set up for June 6th. And you can see just how incredibly complicated this whole operation was. All of these blue lanes are for the cruisers and the battleships, and they had to stay in these lanes and in these boxes, because if they got out of the boxes, they would run over a bunch of the transports, and they'd run over a whole bunch of the landing craft that fingered out from all of these places. And so it's very difficult to make all this work, especially in really dirty weather, really rough seas, and trying to always range in on these batteries like Pointe du Hoc and other places. It was really difficult. And the destroyers here, these lists, we don't have all the names because it'd take forever and they wouldn't fit on the map. But destroyers are detailed to these areas, and they were more of free agents. They were able to roam throughout their own deployment zones because they had to be fast enough and flexible enough to respond to gunfire coming from these German ports. But, they get the big battleships, the British, the Warspite, the Ramillies, American battleships, the Arkansas, the Texas, and the Nevada. Nevada was at Pearl Harbor. These are all old battleships for the Americans and also for the British. These are all World War I era battleships, all of them, both the Americans and the British. And they were slow, but they packed a big wallop, and they did a tremendous amount of damage to the German Atlantic wall here on the beaches. Okay. Right, next. Also, too, of course, everybody knows this, I'm sure, the Americans and the British dropped a number of airborne units on the flanks of the invasion beaches, mostly to protect the flanks of the infantry and the armor once they got ashore, and also to take important strategic points. So for the Americans, the 82nd and the 101st, the British 6th, and 2 independent brigades, one Polish and one British, were dropped in the areas behind the beaches on the evening of 5 and 6 June, okay? So they're dropping at night and behind the beaches to secure landing grounds so that the troops, once they got ashore, would be able to link up with the airborne and move inland much more efficiently and effectively. Because the Americans and the British wanted very much to link 4 of the 5 beaches at the end of D-Day. So having the airborne behind the beaches between, about 1.5 to 2 to 5 miles was going to allow for a very quick linked series of what had been individual beachheads into one large beachhead. It would make it more difficult for the Germans to drive them off and back into the channel. Okay, and again, for everybody who reads this stuff, and very well, best laid plans of mice and men. And this is just, the 101st. This is where they landed. Their landing grounds were supposed to be here, and they got dispersed and landed all over the place. And it took a long time on D-Day, the actual day itself, June 6th, after the landing, to try to bring the disparate elements of the division together to form a larger fighting unit. And there's, if you read about this stuff, it's a really neat adventure, and it's a tremendously stressful time for the airborne units, especially these here, like St. Mary Glees and others where they weren't supposed to land, but they did. They landed in swamps, all this stuff. The best laid plans go awry. And again, some landed where they supposed to, and some did not. And there were consequences, which we'll see when we get on the ground in some of the places, which was very unfortunate for a number of American and British soldiers. The beach landings, backed by elements of both the 8th Air Force and the 9th Army Air Forces. Okay, this was one of those best laid plans things. At Omaha, Eisenhower pulled in a number of heavy bombardment elements from the 8th Air Force, a bunch of B-24s. And the B-24s came over with a heavy bomb load at about 20,000 feet. And the problem was that on the morning of June 6th, it was cloudy. And so they had to bomb through the cloud cover, and they were map bombing. And what the 8th Air Force bombers did was, if this is the beach right here, that top, that top sentence, the B-24s flew across the beach, okay? And so they were map bombing, trying to hit targets back here or on the beach itself. And because they were at 20,000 feet, there was a lot of wind, and they would not see what they were actually bombing. Most of their bombs did not land where they wanted them to. They landed way back here in a bunch of fields and a bunch of swamps. The 9th Air Force, which was B-26s, which is what my dad flew, they did not. They were in Utah. They were not in Omaha. They were in Utah. And rather than fly across the beach at altitude above the cloud cover, they decided to fly down the beach at 6,000 feet and drop their ordnance. So the B-26s were actually seeing the targets they were supposed to hit. And so their success rate and their hit rate was really high, which is one of the reasons why the Allies did not do as much damage at Omaha as they wanted, and they were able to do a lot of damage by air power at Utah, which made the landing much more efficient, much more effective, and the casualties much lighter, okay? Also, naval gunfire, and we'll see when we get to Pointe du Hoc, we'll see a whole bunch of evidence of that even to this very day. And the Allied forces go ashore just after 6:30 on the morning of June 6th. And there were significant casualties in the first waves, especially at Omaha, where the invasion was simply stopped dead in its tracks and almost thrown back into the sea. But the Americans and the British both kept bringing more and more forces because they had all these troops backed up, in the landing ships, and the landing craft just continued to orbit and drop in fresh troops and supplies and material. And so eventually the Allies were able to gain a foothold and then push forward. Germans were not caught totally by surprise, but they were caught somewhat by surprise. And as Torsten will tell us in a little bit, these soldiers, even though many of them were second-line troops and reservists, they did fight hard, and they did fight well. And a number of them died for their cause, in fighting off or trying to fight off the Allied invasion. And again, simply swords, gold, the British beaches and Canadian beach, and then Omaha here, the really bloody one, and then Utah. Okay, so by the numbers, the Allies used nearly 5,000 landing crafts on D-Day, with 289 escort vessels and 277 minesweepers, because Rommel had strewn the channel with mines. And 160,000 troops crossed the channel on the 6th of June, which is a huge amount to move by sea and to put on the ground and then keep supplied with both food, medicine, and the very material of war. And by the 30th of June, the end of the month, there were almost 1 million Allied soldiers on the ground in Normandy. And the casualties for the Americans and the British were really high in this operation. About 10,000 total, with over 4,400 confirmed dead. And the German losses were generally smaller in the period from D-Day to D+10, of about 1,000 confirmed dead. So the Atlantic Wall did do a lot of its job, but it just wasn't strong enough yet in Normandy to stop the massive amount of American troops and British troops that came ashore. Okay, objectives. And this is one of the problems with D-Day, and it gives you an idea of how hard it was to achieve the objectives that the Americans and British thought we would achieve within those first days. The Allies wanted to capture Canton, Saint-Lô, Caen, and Bayeux, all on D-Day itself, on June 6th. Their projections were they would take all these major cities in Normandy by the end of the first day. They also wanted to link up with all 4 of the eastern beaches, Gold Sword, Juno, and Omaha, and then leave Utah because it was just too far off to the west yet. They were going to link them all up at the end of June 6th and create a significant beachhead several miles inland in a big semicircle. And the idea was to link all these up. But as you can see, because this map is at the end of D-Day, June 6th, they never quite got there because the resistance was just too strong, and it was their ideas of taking these towns and cities were just not realistic. Because, here's Saint-Lô, Caen's over here. They just couldn't get the depth of penetration that they wanted on D-Day. It was just not possible. And so the beaches are not actually all connected until D+6, and that's the 12th of June. And Caen wasn't captured until July 21st by the British. And even so, even though the advance is slow or slower than they wanted, no matter how hard they tried, the Germans couldn't push the Allies back into the sea. And so the Atlantic Wall, even though Hitler and the German government and the German Wehrmacht thought that this was going to stop any Allied invasion, it just wasn't strong enough to do it. And so this is a big Allied success. Okay. Again, Atlantic Wall is only about 18% complete. Operation Fortitude, Patton in Dover, pretending to about ready to invade Pas-de-Calais, was successful in drawing off a significant number of German divisions, especially the Panzer divisions, that were not allowed to concentrate on Normandy. And perhaps, and Torsten can give us all a good perspective on that. If the Panzers were released, would it have made a significant impact? And would it have made a significant difference? I mean, this is an open question, and military historians debate it all the time. The other thing the Allies possess that we know frustrated Erwin Rommel greatly, and the Germans greatly, was complete Allied air superiority. Not only were the bomber streams able to hit targets in and around Normandy that cut off communications and destroyed infrastructure that the Germans needed to move troops by rail, the tactical air superiority of British Typhoons, American P-47s, and American P-51s, all armed with rockets and bombs, a 20-millimeter cannon in the Typhoon's case, simply roved all up and down the Normandy battlefront and destroyed German armored trucks and supplies and shot the heck out of troops where they found them. And what it meant was that the Germans could not redeploy strategically. And what Rommel had done initially to bolster his weaker infantry divisions was to break out his panzers into brigade and sometimes even regimental strength. So he decentralized his armor, because the Germans had always on the Eastern Front found they could do that to bolster their defenses, and then when they needed to, pull everything together and use the armor as a strike force. But without air superiority, they couldn't move in the daytime. And because of the gnarled road net in Normandy and the bocage, which again we're going to see when we get there, the Germans couldn't redeploy. So they could never pull their armor together to use it as a single striking arm. And that really hampered the Germans' ability to reply to the Allied offensives. And thus also, too, without any air superiority, the Wehrmacht was unable to observe any Allied movements. And they didn't know where the blows were going to fall because they had no real good intelligence of what the Americans and British were doing. And that also hurt. And last and not least, and again, Torsten can talk about this more than me, the cumbersome German command structure, the army command structure, that had to wait so often for orders from above, and it took forever to push it down to the divisions and the corps, or the corps and the divisions and the battalions the Americans didn't have. Okay, so I'm done. Torsten, go ahead.
Okay, let's see. How do I share myself?
Stop sharing. Right? Isn't that what I got to do, is stop sharing? Yes, I got to stop sharing. Sorry. There you go.
Okay, you stopped? Okay, just told me I cannot.
Can't.
I can. Come on. Okay, share. All right.
There you go.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Can you guys see that?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, to start out with, thank you, Doug. I think you explained really well why the Germans could not move. The problem was, as you just said, the Germans did not have the industrial capacity to react. You said that you had all of these destroyers, all of these tanks, you had trucks, you had jeeps, you had huge amounts of fuel that the Germans just did not have. The Germans didn't have the resources. Number one, Hitler tried to get to the oil fields of the Soviet Union. That failed. In Stalingrad, the road to the oil fields was cut off. And therefore, the Germans just didn't have the capacity to move people back and forth quickly. You already mentioned that there's no air superiority. So if you have airplanes that fly and patrol a certain area, even if you have tanks, airplanes shoot tanks. And that's just the thing. Armor doesn't matter if you have rockets, for instance, or even huge machine guns that can, destroy a tank, for instance. The German army, and this is what the response of most of these soldiers were that were on the beaches, the German soldiers were amazed as to how the Americans got it done to, first of all, move that many people and supply them with motorized transport. Because for the Germans, it was very normal. Only about 17% of the German army was motorized. And I'll tell you in just a little bit why the war was lost. It was actually not because of the Americans and the British. I'll get to that in a little bit. But the soldiers that were defending the beaches at Omaha, for instance, were amazed by the fact that there are no mules, no horses, just trucks and jeeps. And Americans were able to make tanks swim. The German soldiers were baffled. And as soon as the tanks made it to the beaches, the artillery was not enough, armor was not enough, and if you have a machine gun against a tank, it's just unfair. So they had to fall back eventually, right? And as Doug already said, regrouping was not an issue. They couldn't do that because of air superiority. Now, the Germans had kind of figured out that they needed to change their tactics. What they did is they did not fight an aggressive war anymore. They argued by 1944 that Europe, a united Europe, a northwestern Europe, including many other nationalities than the Germans, is fortress Europe, and we need to defend it. Therefore, many of the people fighting, even if they were not #1 frontline units, even if they were people that were healing from a wound, that they were not really able to run or do anything, they could stand at a trench and shoot. That was the idea. And these guys fought very hard because they believed that they need to save the Reich. However, the Reich was lost, and that had a lot to do with the fact that the Soviets had, first of all, geared up their war economy. They had gotten loans from the United States, and the Soviet had tanks. They had lots of oil. They had lots of, as I said, armor, artillery, millions of people, and they even had American jeeps, for instance. So the Soviets, by 1944, were starting to win the war in the East, right? So Operation Bagration started on June 23rd to August 19th, 1944, so just after the beach landings. What the Red Army did is, for the first time, they used a battle tactic that they had invented in the 1920s, between the 20s and 30s. It was called deep battle tactics. I got a little diagram of deep battle tactics. Deep battle tactics basically means you open up a breach in the defenses of the enemy. As you see here, for instance, you encircle and you move quickly. That is done by combining, for instance, the air forces and ground forces and artillery. Once you do that, you move fast. That is only possible if you have motorized units. Now, some of you may ask, what is the difference to Blitzkrieg? Well, Blitzkrieg, almost works like that, except that the Germans were never able to move fast and then take advantage of tactical victories, right? So if something on this corner worked well, they were able to move fresh troops from the back very, very fast into a breach that they had taken. The other thing that the Russians are really good at is what the Americans and the British are good at. The Russian word is maskurovka, which means, the word mask is in there. It means masquerade or camouflage. So what they did is, before Army Group Center was totally destroyed, the Russians played hide and seek with us, and they showed us their armor north of Army Group Center. So everyone thought the battle would happen north, right? Then there's actually a double Maskarovka. The Germans were unprepared because the Soviets tricked us, just like with the Allied beaches. So what happened because of that was a radicalization of the troops in France. So what I would like to talk about a little bit now is why did the Germans do such bad things, right? It had a lot to do with the fact that the armor that the Germans were using, the armor that Rommel was using, were first fighting in Soviet Russia. And the 2nd SS Panzer Division, for instance, had learned in Kharkov that terror works. So if you want to get the civilian population away from guns, if you want to keep resistance down, you hang a lot of people, and that's what they had learned. The problem with the massacres, the 2 big massacres that occurred, is that the French resistance that Doug already mentioned, they were getting ahead of themselves. they were thinking that the Americans now would move really, really quick. They actually went into battle themselves. And they, for instance, the city of, or the town of Tulle in south central France was taken successfully by Marquis troops, by rebel troops on June 6th and June 7th in 1944. By the way, real quick, the resistance, the French resistance, fights in the occupied northern part of France. The south is technically a puppet state. That's Vichy France. The resistance in the south is called the Marquis, right? So Marquis fighters had successfully taken a city. However, they didn't know that armor was really close, right? So one of these SS Panzer divisions retook the city fairly quick. The Marquis resistance fighters leave, they get back into the hills, and what you have is a city, or a small town, in the hands of the 2nd SS Panzer Division that had learned to be brutal in Charkov in the Soviet Union. So what they did is they took randomly, the male citizens, and 117 of these poor guys that they caught were hanged, right? And we see here, of course, this is a not so pretty picture, and I apologize, but this is the this is the face of terror in France that the Germans kind of used to freak out the French population, to force them not to pick up arms and fight with the Marquis or with the resistance. So these guys were hanged on lampposts or this here balconies, very, very openly. The other big massacre that everyone knows about is Oradour, right? Again, the Marquis had captured a SS officer. Nevertheless, we were in the south of France where you have the milice, right? So this is a French military force with the Germans. So they were collaborators. Two of these milice officers notified the German authorities, who then sent, again, the 2nd SS Panzer Division. They surrounded the village and basically separated the men from the women. It was really nasty. And again, the SS Panzer Division had learned how to be brutal in the Soviet Union. They took the men out to sheds in the, on the side of the city. They shot everyone in the legs with machine guns and then set the sheds on fire. They took the women and the children of that city into the church and then threw hand grenades in, and just the tactics they used in the Soviet Union, and then shot everyone that tried to get out. You see the picture here, that's a picture of today. The French have left the village as the 2nd SS Panzer Division left it that day. Now, Hitler was mad. Hitler was really mad that the British had done what he couldn't do with Operation Sea Lion. He very much wanted to invade Britain, but that never materialized. Now, in these last months of the war then, Hitler set everything on really shaky cards. So one of these options that he thought was still there was the V1 flying bomb. We in Germany call that Vergeltungswaffe 1, so it's a vengeance weapon. And again, the Germans are really good when it comes to technology sometimes. However, Hitler gave the resources and the money to the German scientists way too late. So what we have here is a very crude and early form of a cruise missile. This flying bomb, so to speak, was designed for bombing London. The first one was launched on June 13th, 1944, so about a week after the landing. Between the months of June and October, more than 100 missiles were fired at London. And all in all, 9,521 of these flying bombs attacked southeastern England. However, this bomb was very slow. As you see on the back here, this was a very crude rocket engine that didn't work continuously. There was basically it sounded like tuff, 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 right? So it didn't have a continuous stream of propelling, yeah. It didn't go all the way, it didn't go fast. So what Royal Air Force pilots could do, if they were brave and smart enough, and they did that, they would actually fly up to these things when they spotted them and flew next to them and tipped the wingtips of these flying bombs with their own airplanes. The aiming mechanism is a very crude gyro compass. So they knew how far to fly and in what direction. But if you either hit it with artillery from the ground with anti-aircraft guns, or you have a RAF pilot that is brave enough to tip the wings, then these things would fly, start tumbling and fall out of the sky. So when the Germans fell back, they used terror tactics. They tried to get the civilian population not to support the Allied effort. However, and as Doug already said, the material wasn't there. The communication was not there. There was no intelligence because of missing air superiority. So ultimately, the one deep water port, and Doug already said deep water ports are very important to get stuff in and out. The one deep water port was taken by the Americans on June 21st, as Doug already said, and Caen was liberated by British troops on July 9th. Nevertheless, I want to point out, and then maybe that is a thing that I have to say or want to say because I'm German. I'm kidding. No, war is ugly, and what happened in Caen was not so good. There were actually about 2,000 French civilians that were killed in the initial bombing attacks. Right, these civilians tried to hide in a big cathedral, in a thickly walled church building, and of course that building was totally destroyed, and thousands of French civilians died. Now, when the Wehrmacht finally saw that the war was done for, that France was falling very quickly, and that the Soviets were getting really successful, the German army finally reacted, and they said, we need to do something. So there were a few officers that got together even before July 1944, and they tried to get away political power and the control of the army from the Nazis. What they tried to do is they tried to assassinate Hitler. And then some of you may have watched the movie Valkyrie. They tried to use the Ersatzheer, so the army that they had stationed in Berlin, basically, right, for the defense of Berlin. They tried to use that army to take over a coup d'etat, so to speak. They tried to take over Berlin. Now, what happened is that at the Wolfschanze, which is called the English word is a wolf slayer, in the main headquarters of Adolf Hitler in Poland, Hitler was supposed to have a meeting the morning of July 20th in a bunker. The morning was too hot in Poland, so they decided, because there was no air conditioning, no flow and air through, right? So what they tried to do is just change the location to a hut outside. Now, the bomb that Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg had was perfect for a room in a bunker. It would have destroyed Hitler for sure. However, because the building that the meeting was actually held in was a barracks outside, and had a very heavy oaken card table. The blast of the explosion was basically going out the windows. Hitler was hurt, but he was not killed. Now, after communications between the Wolfschanze in Poland and Berlin was reestablished, the Ersatzarmee in Berlin realized that a coup d'etat was going on, and Hitler talked on the telephone to the commanders in Berlin. Some of these officers, of course, were already into it. When they realized that Hitler was alive, they chickened out. Ultimately, 7,000 people were arrested, and that is not only soldiers, it's also their families, right, and their children, for instance. And 4,980 of these were executed. So the German army now was terrorized. The German people were terrorized. They knew that if they would not fight the Allies in the Allied invasion, they would have the same fate as, for instance, Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg. By the way, I also have a personal anecdote to tell. I had a student once in Washington State University whose name was von Stauffenberg, and he told me he was related to Graf Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg. I'm like, really? I was thrilled. So there was a part of the Stauffenberg family that went to the United States. I met the guy. By the way, this is Klaus Graf Schenk von Stauffenberg. He was hurt really bad in the Africa campaign. He's wearing his prosthetic eye and his prosthetic arm. Also not a good choice to use someone that is, hampered in his movements when setting up the bomb. So the question is, why did the German soldiers keep on fighting? Why did they not stop like in World War I? Well, there's two things that we need to consider. First of all, the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community that Hitler always proclaimed and that some historians think is a myth. By 1944, that was not a myth. Not every German soldier in the German army was a Nazi. What they tried to do is they tried to protect East Germany, so nowadays Poland. They tried to protect that from the Soviets who, as they moved into Germany, acted in a way that is, they raped, they killed, they took revenge. Of course, we know nowadays Stalin had told his soldiers that was okay. Of course, we all know that the Germans had used terror tactics in the Soviet Union first. When the Soviets came back, they acted the same way the Germans did, right? So therefore, German soldiers did not stop shooting. The other thing is that the Soviets, on July 22nd, so within weeks, of the Allied landings, they freed one of the first extermination camps, concentration camps with gas chambers, for instance, where people were killed in industrial fashion. The Soviets freed the first camp on July 22nd, 1944. They realized that Nazism is a very bad ideology, right? The other thing that comes into play is that Roosevelt had promised Stalin on January 24th, 1943, that there will only be an unconditional surrender. That means the Germans were not allowed to give up and keep their country, right? The Germans were not allowed to give up and keep their government in place, even if they would have killed Hitler. Therefore, the Germans did not stop fighting, and therefore we see a nasty radicalization of warfare in the East and in the West. And that's pretty much all I had for today.
Cool. Okay. Does anybody have any questions for us?
They were both great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see if I can get my...
Oh, those ports you talked about, Doug, in Normandy. Doug, can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, John. I'm good.
Those ports in Normandy, what were they made of, and how long were they?
The ports? The forts?
Yeah, those long.
Mostly concrete and steel.
Really, they floated, huh?
No, the mulberries you're talking about?
Yes, right.
Right. Yeah, the mulberries were the breakwaters were actually, most of them were sunken merchant vessels that were no longer of any value, and they were sunk. Actually, there was an old battleship as well, the old British battleship as well as the Centurion. It was an old Iron Duke class that had been used as a target since the 30s. But what they did was they brought them into the within whatever 200 yards, 300 yards, whatever it was, at the beach, and sank them so that their upper works were above the water. Make sense?
They didn't look like ships. They looked like concrete.
Right. And that's some of that stuff is there, John. They also did that. Like at Armange, they actually had hollowed out, you don't live in the Midwest, river traffic. River traffic in Oregon, yeah, heavy river traffic. Do you have that?
Chicago.
Chicago. Sorry, the barges, right? The barges on the Chicago River.
Yeah.
Yeah. Imagine one of those things full of concrete, and you sink it, and you sink it up to 5 feet with extending out of the water, and it becomes a breakwater.
Okay, but Doug, what we saw from the air was flat top surface. So what was that? Was that something put on top of these sunken ships?
Yep, exactly.
Okay, and secondly, do boats float up to those things and then tie up? Is that?
Yes,
okay.
Right. And then they could unload and go down those causeways, which are just pontoon causeways.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I have a basic question. When
Yes,
you
ma'am.
showed a picture of the map and you showed the places they could land, Belgium wasn't an option? They didn't have ports, or they weren't the right? What was the reason why it was France?
It was France because, well, it was close to the southern coast of Great Britain. And when you look at the map, let me go back to my PowerPoint here, if I can. Sorry. There it is. All right. Then it's time to go here. There we go. You see this, Shauna? Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So when you look at the map, it is closer to move, or it's closer to all of these ports. Normandy's closer to all those ports: Southampton, Portsmouth, Plymouth, Exeter, Bristol, London, Dover, all these major ports in the UK. Liverpool's just right up the way. You know, it's closer to Glasgow, major shipbuilding center, further up into Scotland, but coming down the Irish Sea, which is protected because of Allied naval and air superiority, to get to, Land's End, then come in. This is all much closer to all these major ports that you can't just load everything into Dover and shovel it over to Dunkirk, because you get a bottleneck. Yeah. This way you have much more ability to use all those ports to funnel supplies into the beaches, into Normandy. And it was just a place that they chose. The Americans, actually, to be fair, the US wanted to invade right there at the Pas de Calais, because that was the closest point to Britain. And during the First World War, and even the Second World War, both, there were artillery batteries here that actually shot over to Calais, and the Germans had batteries in Calais that actually shot over to Dover. So the Americans thought, you just go to the shortest distance and you just hammer your way home, and sooner or later we're going to get through. And it was the British that said, no, it's going to have a bottleneck. It's not going to work. And we need to go someplace that the German defenses are a little bit weaker, because the Atlantic Wall was far stronger up here, because the Germans knew that the distance was so short. And these fortress ports were, really going to be tough nuts to crack. What made Cherbourg easiest was once the Americans cut off all German supply on the Cotentin Peninsula, Cherbourg was just an isolated nothing. Without any food and without any material, without any ammunition, the Germans just gave up. Does that help?
Yep.
Okay. Anything else?
Well, no one else has any more questions.
Keep going.
Kirsten, I got the impression from your comments about the horses in the German army that there were still a fair number of horses they were using for transport.
Absolutely, horses and mules. Yes.
Really, at this late stage of the game. Wow.
Every German battalion always had a veterinarian with them. Ultimately, that's what they had, because we didn't have enough oil. We didn't have enough resources. And since Stalingrad, that wasn't an option anymore. So the Germans tried to make up things that would, allow them to use, for instance, burning wood, right? So they had actually machines that they can put on a truck that you then modify, that works with black smoke. It had to be wet wood, but those were all things that, technology, they tried to use technology, but it was all way too late. They didn't have the ability to move big machines, and they always used horses and mules. Most German infantry moved by bicycle, actually.
Jeepers. Real quickly, you mentioned Germans couldn't get to the source of oil in Russia, but didn't they get a lot of oil from Romania? Or by that time, it had already been taken over by the Russians.
The Romanians were German allies, but and they had oil from Romania. But when the Soviets overran that part too, we were absolutely cut off.
And they had overrun Romania by June of '44, huh?
I think you're right. I'm not 100% sure when that happened. Yes.
Okay.
But, oh, now I got to look this up. I can't use my computer. What is it? It's the 15th Air Force. It's Brereton's Air Force.
Well,
And it's 44. I know that. When's the Puleshti raid? Oh, the Puleshti raid's August 1st, 1943. So it's actually a year before.
who's raiding Plesty?
15th Air Force.
Is that the U.S.?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. That was Brereton's command after what's the word I want? The Philippines.
okay.
He was in the Philippines on December 8th, well, December 1941, and he got transferred over to Europe.
Okay.
But
Well, that was a really nice introduction to what we're going to be visiting. Good background. Thanks very much, guys.
You're welcome.
No problem. You're welcome.
Okay.
Anything else? Anybody got anything else at all?
I have one more question.
Yeah, Shauna, go ahead.
You were talking about the airborne units when they were parachuting, and you mentioned British and Polish.
Yeah.
Where did the Polish come from?
Oh,
They have gotten away from the
They
Germans.
got out.
Yes, they have. Yes.
How did that happen?
large numbers that I know of. Torsten, you got to help me out.
Yeah.
Help me out, you know more. Large numbers of Polish troops got out in at least the ones I know of, the Carpathian army, the Carpathian troops. Those divisions were able to filter their way out. They dropped their arms. They filtered out through actually Romania and through Hungary, and then found their way down to Greece, many of them, or in the Black Sea, and out to Great Britain. And there were, oh goodness, there was the airborne, there was a brigade, wasn't a full division. And then there was a Polish armored division and a Polish infantry division. And when I did my year abroad as an undergraduate in Scotland, in Glasgow, there was a ex-Polish officers club or Polish soldiers club that still existed. And they were all old men by then. This is in the 80s, they were initially, because those guys couldn't go back to Poland after the war, they fought to liberate, and then of course they hoped that Stalin would go away. And when the Soviets never left, they all stayed in Britain. They just emigrated to the UK.
Oh.
But there's a lot of them. I mean, there were, a couple divisions worth of Polish infantry, well, armor and infantry and airborne. There were a lot of Poles that got out and never got a chance to go home. So
And as Germans, we wouldn't have known. They looked from far away like Britons, with their steel helmets and their guns, Of course, they had Polish insignia, and yes, but they were free.
Outfitted. The British outfitted them. So
they
looked like British soldiers.
There were free Polish forces. There were free French forces fighting, that existed despite the fact that Germans had taken over France and Poland. Yeah.
Right. And the Americans were the ones who funded and equipped all the Free French.
Oh, really good. Yeah.
The British equipped the Poles and and then it's Sword Beach that is Canadian, and that's a Canadian beach. It's all Canadian infantry and Canadian armor that go ashore there. So it's a I know it sounds silly. It's a multinational effort. Obviously, it's a multinational effort. So.
Just like on the German side, when I said Fortress Europe, I'm talking about the propaganda had changed. They were not talking about Greater Germany anymore. They were talking about keeping Northwestern Europe free of democracy and Bolshevism. Is what their goal was. As stupid as that sounds today. Yeah.
Although apparently the British are trying to do that to this very day to themselves, so God only knows.
That is correct.
So,
yeah.
Did that answer your question, Shauna?
It did.
Okay.
Voila.
You make
Okay.
anything else? We good?
I got something.
Go ahead, Larry. What do you got?
The Polish also had a destroyer called the Błyskawica that escaped in 1939
Mhm.
in the early parts of the war, and it was actually a few Polish destroyers actually served alongside the British Royal Navy and did a lot of the submarine hunting up in the North Sea and all. And I thought that was pretty cool that actually some Polish ships, and they survive, and actually in Poland to this day that ship is on display and has the highest honor in Poland and all.
That's cool. It must be up in Gdansk, right?
Somewhere around there. I know I was just doing a little bit of research on it, but they finally retired her in 1976 and all. But no, she was able to escape and worked right alongside the Royal Navy.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah.
And it was a whole Polish, like they tried to serve as much as they could. The whole Polish crew tried to serve as much as they could and volunteer for all the stuff they could.
Well, and there were free Greeks as well, and there were free Belgians. Both those soldiers from most occupied countries fought in North Africa, and then the Greeks were also involved in the liberation invasion of Greece in late 1944, early 1945. That the British under British auspices, and again they're equipped by the British. They look like British troops. They're using Lee Enfields. They're probably, if they've got armor, they're using Shermans because God knows you didn't want to drive around in a British tank. But the Sherman wasn't a whole lot better by 1944 terms. But the Cromwell was nothing to want to ride around in either. So but was what it was. Cool. So are we good? Are we good for tonight? Yeah. Well, thanks for showing up, everybody. We do appreciate it, and we will, continue these things, and we'll do it again next month. I'll put this up on my YouTube channel for everybody to watch again if you want to watch it again, or for those who couldn't make it, they can watch it. So if you have any questions, let us know. We'll be happy to answer whatever we can. And well, I guess we'll talk to you soon, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you,
All
guys.
right. And there it is right there. Where to go? Come on. That's it.